Starfleet has catalogued thousands of species, mapped the edges of known space, and built a civilization on the premise that reason, diplomacy, and scientific inquiry can answer any question the cosmos poses. But what happens when something defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? What happens when the universe doesn't send a diplomat, a scientist, or even a conqueror, but instead delivers a predator? The Enterprise D was conducting a gravitational survey of the Devolin system when Lieutenant Commander Data detected the anomaly. The region was already flagged as unstable, a cluster of overlapping subspace shear points that caused navigational interference and periodic sensor blackouts. Routine, by Starfleet standards. The kind of assignment that filled a week's logs with unremarkable data and gave the crew time to breathe between crises. Then the readings stopped making sense. "Captain?" Data's voice carried its characteristic precision, but there was something beneath it, the computational equivalent of unease. "I am detecting a subspace rupture at bearing 274 Mark 15. The energy signature does not correspond to any catalogued phenomenon." Jean-Luc Picard rose from the command chair with measured calm. In 23 years of Starfleet service, he had learned to distinguish between anomalies that could wait and anomalies that could not. The way Counselor Troy stiffened in her chair, hands pressing flat against her armrests, something shifting behind her eyes, told him this one could not wait. On screen. The view screen filled with a tear. That was the only word for it. Not an explosion, not a wormhole's elegant spiral, a tear, as though someone had dragged a blade across the fabric of space itself. Its edges pulsed with irregular chromatic energy, cycling through frequencies the ship's sensors were still trying to classify. "Field," Worf reported from tactical, his deep voice carrying the clipped efficiency of a man already calculating threats. "Approximately 40 cubic meters. Hull composition is unknown. Alloys do not match any Federation, Klingon, Romulan, or Cardassian design. The vessel was approximately 30 meters in length before." He paused, which for Worf was itself remarkable. "Destruction. Survivors?" Riker asked. Data's fingers moved across his console. "Sensors are detecting one life sign within the debris field. Humanoid. Cardiovascular and neurological function are." Another pause, this one genuinely rare. "Remarkable, given the circumstances. The individual appears to have survived direct exposure to the subspace rupture event at close range." Picard was already moving toward the con. "Beam them directly to sickbay. Shields down, transporter room 3. Dr. Crusher to sickbay immediately." What materialized on the transporter pad of sickbay 14 seconds later was not what anyone expected. He was large, not in the exaggerated way of Klingon warriors bred for ceremony, but in the dense, economical way of something that had been stress-tested by survival and come out harder on the other side. Shaved head, dark skin crosshatched with old scars that told stories no personnel file would ever contain. His clothing was unfamiliar, layered, practical, built for a man who expected to be uncomfortable and had stopped caring about it. His hands were already moving before the transporter shimmer fully cleared, fingers searching instinctively for weapons that weren't there. And his eyes. Dr. Beverly Crusher had treated thousands of patients across dozens of species. She had seen bioluminescent irises, compound visual organs, eyes designed for infrared and ultraviolet spectrums. But when the man on her biobed opened his eyes and the light caught them, a silver-white shine that reflected the overhead illumination like a cat's eyes in darkness, she took an involuntary step back. He looked at her. Then he looked at the ceiling, the walls, the biobed restraints that she hadn't engaged because she hadn't thought to. "Different place," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, textured like gravel. A statement, not a question. He sat up. "Please don't," Beverly began. "Not gonna hurt you." He swung his legs off the biobed and stood. He was already cataloging the room, exits, personnel, equipment. "Where am I?" Beverly kept her voice steady. "You're aboard the Federation Starship Enterprise. You were found in a debris field following a subspace rupture. You're lucky to be alive." The man's expression didn't change. Something moved behind those silver eyes, not gratitude, not relief. Something older and more patient than either. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," he said. "If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper." In the corridor outside sickbay, Worf was already stationed at the door, hand resting on his phaser. He had reviewed the sensor data 3 times. The man inside had survived hard vacuum exposure, subspace rupture radiation, and the complete destruction of his vessel with no environmental suit and no apparent protective technology. His cardiovascular readings were abnormal, heart rate lower than it should be, neurological response times that pushed the edge of what human physiology could theoretically produce. Worf had fought Jem'Hadar in training simulations. He had sparred with Klingon warriors of legendary reputation. He had faced the Borg. He looked at the biobed readings on the corridor display and felt, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely uncertain about what was on the other side of that door. His name, they would learn in the next hour through careful questioning, was Riddick. Just Riddick. He offered no rank, no planet of origin he was willing to confirm, no explanation for the silver eyes beyond a single sentence delivered with complete indifference. "Had em done in a prison. Cost me a box of Kylerian sugar." He answered Picard's questions with the minimum number of words required. He ate the replicated food they brought him without comment. He did not ask to leave sickbay. He simply waited, the way a predator waits when it's learning the shape of new territory, and let the Enterprise believe it had the situation under control. Picard convened the senior staff briefing 40 minutes after Riddick's arrival, while the man himself remained in sickbay under what Worf had diplomatically described as observation, and what was, functionally, a 2 security officer guard detail that Riddick hadn't acknowledged by so much as a glance. The observation lounge felt different with the viewscreen still displaying the remnant energy signatures of the subspace rupture. A fading scar across the Devlin system's gravitational map that Data's algorithms were still attempting to classify. Outside the tall windows, the debris field from Riddick's destroyed vessel drifted in slow constellation, pieces of an unknown civilization's engineering turning silently in the void. "What do we know?" Picard asked. Data clasped his hands on the table with characteristic precision. "The vessel that emerged from the subspace rupture was constructed using metallurgical techniques consistent with human engineering, though the specific alloy compositions suggest significant temporal or dimensional variance. Based on whole fragment analysis, the vessel was equipped with a rudimentary faster-than-light propulsion system, functional, but considerably less sophisticated than warp drive. The rupture itself appears to have been an uncontrolled dimensional transit event rather than a naturally occurring phenomenon." "Meaning someone caused it?" Riker asked. "Meaning the rupture was a consequence of the vessel's drive system interacting catastrophically with the Devlin system's subspace shear points. Whether intentional or accidental, I cannot determine with current data." Troy spoke carefully. "I've spent time with him. He's—" She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Extraordinarily controlled. His emotional signature is unlike anything I've encountered. There's intelligence, significant intelligence, operating beneath a surface that he's deliberately constructed to project danger." "Is he dangerous?" Riker asked. "Unquestionably," Troy said. "But not randomly so. His emotional architecture suggests a man who makes very deliberate choices about when and how to act. He's not impulsive. He's patient." She paused again. "He's been assessing us since the moment he opened his eyes." Worf straightened in his chair. He had been quiet through the briefing's opening, which meant he had been thinking, and when Worf thought quietly for this long, the conclusion was invariably one that demanded attention. "I have reviewed his physical readings in detail. His musculature, neurological response architecture, and cardiovascular efficiency exceed human baseline by margins that are not attributable to training alone. Dr. Crusher's analysis suggests genetic factors, possibly species level, possibly individual. He is stronger than he appears, faster than his resting state suggests, and his visual modification allows him to function in complete darkness with full spatial awareness. The table was quiet for a moment. A man who sees perfectly in the dark, Riker said slowly, who survived the destruction of his ship in open space, and who has spent the last 40 minutes saying as little as possible while studying our security protocols. That is an accurate summary. Data confirmed. Picard leaned back in his chair, pressing 2 fingers against his lips, his thinking posture, the one that meant he was weighing options against principles and finding the arithmetic uncomfortable. Mr. Data, is there any indication that he poses an immediate threat to this crew? No actionable evidence of hostile intent, Captain. However, I would note that a sufficiently patient and capable individual would not demonstrate hostile intent until they had completed their environmental assessment. Which is exactly what Counselor Troy just told us he's doing, Riker added. Indeed. Picard stood, moving to the window. The debris field caught the distant starlight, fragments of a world Riddick had come from, whatever world that was, reduced to tumbling metal. There was something in that image that tugged at him. Whatever else this man was, he had just lost everything that connected him to his own reality. Every ship, every contact, every familiar star pattern, gone. The Federation had faced first contact scenarios with beings of extraordinary power, but those encounters had almost always involved the powerful party arriving with intent. Riddick had arrived by accident, alone, with nothing. That, Picard understood, changed the ethical equation considerably. We treat him as we would any survivor of an unknown vessel, Picard said, turning back to the table. First contact protocols apply. He is not a prisoner, he is a guest. A guest we observe carefully, but a guest nonetheless. Mr. Worf, I want security personnel present but unobtrusive. No visible weapons unless he escalates. Counselor, continue building rapport. Data, everything we can learn about the dimensional origin point goes to the science team immediately. Worf's expression made his opinion of the unobtrusive instruction perfectly clear, but he nodded. Understood, Captain? However, I recommend we do not give him access to the maintenance corridors, the armory deck, or any section of the ship where lighting can be manually controlled. Picard raised an eyebrow. Explain. A man who sees in complete darkness and is accustomed to confined spaces and close-quarters survival should not be given access to the sections of this ship where those abilities provide maximum advantage. Worf's jaw set. It is what I would do. In his position. The observation lounge was quiet again. Riker looked at Worf. Worf looked at Picard. Picard looked at the debris field. Restrict access accordingly, Picard said quietly. And have someone bring him something to drink. Tea, coffee, whatever he prefers. I'll speak with him personally within the hour. The meeting dissolved into motion, Data heading for the science lab, Troy for sickbay, La Forge for an engineering analysis of the rupture's energy signature. Worf remained at the table a moment longer than the others, studying the biometric display on his pad. Riddick's vital signs, steady and unhurried as a predator at rest. In sickbay, Riddick accepted the coffee that an ensign nervously delivered, drank half of it, and set the cup down. He had counted the security camera positions, identified 3 potential exit routes, assessed both guards' dominant hands, and determined that the ship's artificial lighting grid ran on a centralized power system with multiple manual override points. He wasn't planning an escape. Not yet. He was simply making sure he knew how, because a man who didn't know how wasn't a man who got to make choices. And Riddick had spent his entire life ensuring that whatever happened next, the choices were his. The power failure began at 0214 hours ship's time. It started small, the way the worst things always do. A cascade fault in the EPS relay junction on Deck 11, The kind of microfracture that LaForge's diagnostic sweeps occasionally flagged for routine maintenance, and that, in ordinary circumstances, would have been repaired by a junior engineer before Alpha's shift without a single log entry worth reading. But the devil in systems residual subspace interference had been threading through the Enterprise's systems since the rupture event, introducing harmonic instabilities into power conduits throughout the ship. The Deck 11 fault didn't stay on Deck 11. It cascaded. Emergency lighting engaged across 14 decks simultaneously, a dim, amber wash that reduced the Enterprise's gleaming corridors to something that felt older and more uncertain. Primary systems held. Life support, warp containment shields. But internal sensors flickered. Security camera feeds dropped to 60% coverage. And in sickbay on Deck 12, the overhead lighting panels died completely for 11 seconds before the backup grid caught them. 11 seconds of total darkness. It was enough. When the amber emergency lighting stuttered back to life, both security officers outside sickbay were on the floor. Not dead. Their vital signs were steady, their injuries limited to precisely applied pressure to carotid arteries and brachial nerve clusters. Professional. Economical. A man who wanted them dead would have left them dead. These two were simply set aside. Riddick was gone. Worf's communicator screamed at him before he'd fully processed the alert on his pad. He was moving before the second chirp, hand already on his phaser, running the calculus of the ship's current sensor coverage against the 17 sections where a man with Riddick's capabilities could effectively disappear. The math was not encouraging. All security teams, this is Lieutenant Commander Worf. The individual from sickbay is at large. Do not pursue alone. Teams of 3 minimum. He is to be considered extremely dangerous. Stun settings only, and be advised that approaching from behind in low-light conditions is not recommended. He paused at a junction, listening to the ship's sounds the way a hunter listens to a forest. Pattern search, decks 10 through 14. Seal Jeffries tube access points. Seal maintenance corridor junctions. Now. On the bridge, Picard received the report with characteristic composure, or what appeared to be characteristic composure. Riker, standing beside him, knew the captain well enough to see the subtle tension at the jaw that meant Picard was angry at himself for not seeing this coming. How long until full sensor coverage is restored? Picard asked. Approximately 22 minutes, Data reported. The EPS cascade has compromised internal sensor nodes on 6 decks. I am rerouting power from non-essential systems, but the harmonic interference from the subspace rupture is complicating restoration. Can we use the ship's internal communications to speak with him directly? Data considered. If he is willing to respond, yes. However, given that he has demonstrated awareness of our sensor architecture by timing his movement to the 11-second coverage gap, it seems unlikely he will. Try anyway. Picard moved to the command chair and activated the ship-wide channel. He kept his voice measured, not commanding, not pleading. The tone of a man who had negotiated with species that could collapse stars, and understood that tone was its own form of argument. Mr. Riddick. This is Captain Picard. I want to be direct with you. You are not a prisoner aboard this ship, and the actions of the last several minutes, while understandable given your circumstances, have complicated what I had hoped would be a straightforward conversation. I am asking you to come to the bridge voluntarily. I give you my word that no punitive action will be taken. A beat. You are a man who has survived by understanding his environment. I would ask you to understand this one. We have nowhere to be adversaries here. Silence on the channel. Then, from somewhere in the amberlit labyrinth of Deck 12's maintenance infrastructure, a voice came back, low, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man speaking from a position he had chosen rather than been forced into. Nice speech. Worf, moving through a maintenance corridor on Deck 11 with 2 security officers at his back, stopped. The voice had come through the comm system, which meant Riddick had found a wall panel. Which meant Riddick had been inside the wall. Worf looked at the Jeffries tube access point 3 meters ahead of him. The seal he had ordered applied was intact. He looked at the one behind him. It was open. He spun. And Riddick was there, crouched in the tube's mouth, silver eyes catching the amber emergency lighting and throwing it back like mirrors. He was close enough that Worf could see the old scar tissue along his jaw, the absolute absence of alarm in his expression. He had been behind them for at least 30 seconds. He hadn't done anything with that advantage. "Could have taken your weapons," Riddick said, looking at Worf with the evaluating stillness of something deciding whether a thing was prey or peer. "Didn't. Could have used your two guys back there as leverage. Didn't." He tilted his head slightly. "I wanted to see how you move. How you think." A pause. "You're better than the rest of them." Worf's phaser was leveled, steady as stone. His finger was not on the trigger. "You will come with us." "Probably," Riddick said. "But not because you've got a weapon pointed at me." He glanced at the phaser with the mild interest of a man noting the weather. "Because your captain asked politely." Worf, and something shifted in them, a recalibration, the look of a predator that has found something worth paying attention to. "I want to know more about you." The corridor hummed with the Enterprise's systems working to restore themselves. Amber light played across old scars and Klingon forehead ridges alike. Worf did not lower his phaser. But he did not fire. "Move," he said. Riddick smiled, small, genuine, the smile of a man who has found something rare. Then he unfolded from the Jeffries tube with the fluid economy of someone who has spent a lifetime in confined spaces, stood to his full height, and walked ahead of Worf toward the turbolift without looking back. He didn't need to look back. He already knew exactly where everyone was. Picard met them in Corridor 7 on Deck 8, neutral ground, deliberately chosen, far enough from the bridge to avoid the impression of an interrogation and far enough from the brig to avoid the impression of a threat. He had dismissed the additional security teams, a decision that had produced the most sustained expression of controlled outrage Worf had managed without actually speaking since the Cardassian border incident of 2368. Riddick walked the corridor with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided it belonged to him. He catalogued Picard the way he had catalogued everything else aboard the Enterprise, efficiently, without obvious effort, filing observations behind those silver eyes like a librarian who never forgets a single entry. Medium height, lean, the posture of a man who carried authority as a natural condition rather than a performed one. No weapons visible. The kind of calm that came from genuine confidence rather than ignorance of danger. "Interesting," those eyes said, without saying anything. "Mr. Riddick." Picard extended his hand. "I appreciate you accepting my invitation." Riddick looked at the hand for a half-second, not suspicious, just noting it, and shook it. His grip was controlled. A man who knew exactly how hard he could squeeze and had chosen something appropriate for the context. Didn't have a lot of other options. "You had several," Picard said evenly. "You chose this one. I'd like to understand why." They walked. Picard had found, over decades of first contact situations, that conversation moved better when bodies were moving too, something about forward momentum that loosened what sitting across a table tended to calcify. Worf followed at a distance that was simultaneously respectful of the captain's intent and completely non-negotiable. Riddick talked in the way he did everything, minimally, precisely, offering what he calculated was necessary and nothing beyond it. He confirmed what their sensors had suggested. He was from a different dimensional iteration of what appeared to be human space, centuries ahead of Earth's current development in some respects, centuries behind in others. No Federation. No Starfleet. A harder universe. One where the distances between safety and catastrophe were measured in hours rather than parsecs, where the political structures that governed human space were fragmented, mercenary, and largely indifferent to individual survival. "Sounds like a difficult existence," Picard said. "Sounds like reality," Riddick replied. "Not defensively. Just factually." Picard absorbed this. And your vessel, the ship that came through the rupture with you. Was there anyone else aboard? Something moved across Riddick's face. Not grief exactly. Something older and more weathered than grief. The expression of a man who had processed loss so many times that it no longer broke the surface, only shifted the bedrock beneath. No. Picard nodded and let it rest. He had learned when not to pull a thread. What happened next was not planned. In Picard's reconstruction of events afterward, he would identify 3 contributing factors. The residual tension from Riddick's unsanctioned movement through the ship, the accumulated pressure of Worf's professional pride operating against its limits, and the specific quality of silence that fell when Riddick, pausing at a corridor viewport and looking out at the stars with an expression that was entirely unreadable, said quietly, "Your security chief. He wants to go." Worf stopped walking. "Lieutenant Commander Worf is a decorated Starfleet officer," Picard said carefully. "Sure." Riddick turned from the viewport. Those silver eyes found Worf with the precision of targeting sensors. "He's also been running combat scenarios against me in his head since I came out of that tube. I can see it. The way he shifts his weight. The way he breathes different when he's deciding something." A pause. "He wants to know." The corridor was very quiet. Worf stepped forward. Picard recognized the moment, had seen it before in varying configurations across dozens of species. The point at which a warrior's professional discipline and personal pride reached an intersection that diplomacy could not navigate. He could order Worf to stand down. Worf would obey. And the tension between these two would calcify into something harder and more dangerous than a resolved confrontation. "Captain," Worf said, with the careful formality of a man who has already made a decision and is performing the courtesy of announcing it. "I request permission to conduct a formal assessment of the individual's combat capabilities. Holodeck protocols. Controlled environment." Picard looked at Riddick. Riddick looked back with the patient expression of a man who had already said yes before the question was finished forming. "Controlled environment," Picard said. "Dr. Crusher on standby. And Mr. Worf." He held the Klingon's gaze. "This is an assessment. Not a hunt." Worf's expression suggested he understood the distinction and found it only partially relevant. The holodeck on Deck 11 was configured to a neutral environment, an open space, gray-floored, lit to standard levels. No weapons generated. No terrain advantages. Worf had specified the parameters himself, with the scrupulous fairness of a warrior who wanted to win without footnotes. They squared off with 6 meters between them. Worf moved first. A Klingon combat opening, explosive and linear, designed to overwhelm with mass and aggression. It was devastating against virtually every opponent he had ever faced. The force, the speed, the committed ferocity of it had ended holodeck simulations of legendary warriors inside 3 seconds. Riddick wasn't there when it arrived. He had moved laterally with an economy that seemed almost lazy until you processed that he had read the attack's initiation point and departure angle before Worf's foot had fully left the floor. He let Worf's momentum carry past him, applied a single precise redirection at the shoulder, and Worf hit the holodeck floor hard enough to register surprise. Worf was up in under a second. That was genuine. Klingon recovery speed was not something that could be faked or trained away. He reassessed, adjusted, came again, this time with combinations, feints, the layered attacking philosophy of a warrior who had learned that the first strike was a question, not an answer. Riddick answered each question with minimum necessary movement. He didn't dominate. He deflected, redirected, positioned, fighting the way something fights when it is more interested in understanding an opponent than defeating them. He took 2 hits that he could have avoided, absorbing them with a roll of the shoulder that distributed impact and filed information. Then Worf landed something real. A right cross with the full rotation of a Klingon frame behind it, catching Riddick across the jaw. Riddick's head snapped. He stepped back, touched his lip, looked at the blood on his fingers. The silver eyes came up, and for the first time since his arrival aboard the Enterprise, something in them changed. "There it is," Riddick said quietly. What followed lasted 4 minutes and would be reviewed by Worf privately, repeatedly, and without comment to anyone, for weeks afterward. Not because he lost, though he did, twice, before forcing a technical standstill that Riddick acknowledged with a nod. But because in 4 minutes of honest violence, he had encountered something he had not expected to find outside a Klingon body. A warrior who fought without anger, without ego, without anything except pure, cold, magnificent competence. When it was over, both men were breathing hard. Worf stood with his hand braced against his knee. Riddick stood straight, bleeding from the lip, silver eyes steady. "You fight like you're always in the dark," Worf said. It was not an insult. "Always am," Riddick replied. It was not a metaphor. Worf straightened, looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating respect of a Klingon reassessing a fundamental assumption. Then he did something that those who knew him would have called remarkable. He inclined his head. Riddick returned it. Outside the holodeck, Picard stood with Beverly Crusher and said nothing. Beverly was already preparing her medkit. Picard was thinking about what it meant that the most honest conversation Worf had managed with their guest had required no words at all. The warbird decloaked at 0847 hours the following morning, 3 kilometers off the Enterprise's port bow, with the particular theatrical precision that the Romulan Star Empire had spent generations perfecting. It was not an accident of timing. Romulans did not do accidental timing. The vessel materialized from its cloaking envelope like something emerging from a decision that had already been made. A warbird Riddick's class, its curved twin hulls sweeping forward in the predatory silhouette that Starfleet tactical officers learned to recognize the way prey species learned to recognize the shape of things that hunted them. The hail came before the Enterprise's tactical alert had finished cycling. On the view screen, the Romulan commander was a woman of perhaps 60 by human reckoning, though with Romulans the arithmetic of apparent age and actual age was unreliable at best. High cheekbones, dark eyes carrying the particular quality of intelligence that had learned to perform patience while remaining fundamentally impatient. Her uniform bore the insignia of a full commander, but the way she occupied the frame of the view screen suggested rank was a formality she had long since grown past needing. "Captain Picard?" Her Federation standard was flawless. "I am Commander Torith of the Imperial Warbird Kazara. I trust we have not interrupted anything of consequence." "Commander." Picard's tone was diplomatic bedrock, warm enough for courtesy, firm enough to signal that the pleasantries had a finite budget. "This is unexpected. The Devolan system is not within the neutral zone." "No," Torith agreed pleasantly. "It is not. We detected the subspace rupture event from considerable distance. The energy signature was—" She paused with the precision of someone selecting a word they had already chosen. "Distinctive. The Empire has interests in understanding unusual spatial phenomena. Surely the Federation can appreciate that impulse." Behind the diplomatic language was architecture, and Picard read it the way he read everything, carefully, completely, without allowing his reading to show on his face. The Romulans had not come for the rupture. They had come too quickly, with too much certainty, and a Riddick-class warbird was not a science vessel. They had come because their intelligence network, which Picard had long suspected extended into Starfleet's own administrative channels, had told them something interesting had come through that rupture. They had come for Riddick. "We're conducting our own survey of the phenomenon," Picard said. "We'd be happy to share our preliminary findings through standard diplomatic channels." Torres smiled. It was a precise instrument. "How generous!" In the spirit of that generosity, our sensors detected a life sign in the debris field before you retrieved it. We wondered if we might inquire after your passenger. The bridge was professionally quiet. Riker stood at parade rest beside the command chair, which was his version of visible tension. Data's fingers moved fractionally across his console. At tactical, Worf's stillness had the quality of something coiled rather than resting. Our passenger is recovering from injuries sustained in the rupture event, Picard said. Standard humanitarian protocols apply. I'm sure you understand. Of course. Torotha's smile remained exactly where she had placed it. We simply want to ensure your passenger is comfortable. Perhaps we might arrange a meeting to determine whether they require any specific care. The channel closed. The warbird held its position. Picard turned to Worf. How long have they been out there? Worf's jaw set. Based on the decay pattern of their cloaking field's residual tachyon signature, approximately 9 hours. 9 hours. They had been watching since shortly after Riddick's arrival. Which meant their intelligence hadn't come from Starfleet channels, it had come from the rupture event itself, from whatever monitoring systems the Tal Shiar had seeded throughout this region of space. Picard filed this and moved forward. Get me Mr. Riddick. They met in the observation lounge, which Picard chose because its windows faced the direction of the warbird and he wanted Riddick to see it. He had found that context, properly presented, was more honest than briefing. Riddick looked at the Deridex-class silhouette hanging in the stars for a long moment. His expression didn't change. Bigger than anything I've seen. Military? Romulan Star Empire, Picard said. One of the major powers in this quadrant. Militaristic, highly intelligent, secretive by nature and doctrine. Their intelligence service, the Tal Shiar, is among the most effective covert organizations in the known galaxy. He paused. They appear to have known about your arrival almost immediately. And they want me. They want to understand what you are. In Romulan strategic thinking, something they don't understand is a vulnerability. Something they can control is an asset. Picard sat across from him. I want to be direct with you, because I believe you respond better to directness than to diplomacy. The Romulans will not ask politely. They will not extend humanitarian protocols. If they acquire you, it will not be for your benefit. Riddick processed this with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had been wanted by dangerous organizations before and had developed a functional philosophy about it. What do you want from me? Nothing, Picard said. Your safety is not a transaction. Those silver eyes held Picard's for a moment with the particular quality of someone testing the structural integrity of a statement they hadn't expected to believe. You mean that? I do. Riddick leaned back, looking at the warbird again. A long silence settled, comfortable on his side, charged on everyone else's. Then, tell me about them. How they think. How they move. What they're afraid of. Picard recognized the request for what it was, not aggression, not escape planning. Intelligence gathering. The instinct of a survivor who understood that knowledge was the prerequisite for every other option. He told him. Romulan hierarchy, Tal Shiar methodology, the political dynamics that govern how a commander like Toroth would be operating, the pressure from her superiors, the career calculus of returning with something valuable versus returning with nothing, the way Romulan patience could turn to decisive action without visible transition. Riddick listened without interrupting. Once he asked a question. Precise, tactical, the kind of question that revealed he had been building an accurate model of Romulan decision-making from the information as it arrived rather than waiting until the end. They'll make a move, he said when Picard finished. Tonight, probably. They've been patient long enough to have a plan, but they've been out there 9 hours already. Something's pushing them. What makes you say tonight? Riddick looked at him with the silver eyes. Because that's when I'd do it. In the corridor outside, Worf had been standing close enough to the door to hear the last exchange. He looked at the security officer beside him, a young Bajoran ensign named Tyrell who had the misfortune of being assigned to whatever Worf was doing that week. Double the internal sensor coverage on all transporter rooms, Worf said quietly. And tell Law Forge I need a tachyon pulse emitter configured for lateral dispersal. Ensign Tyrell blinked. To detect cloaked ships at close range? To detect anything that shouldn't be here. Worf looked at the observation lounge door. Our guest has better instincts than our sensors. We should start acting accordingly. Inside, Riddick was still watching the warbird. Patient. Still. Reading its silhouette the way he had read the Enterprise's corridors, finding the angles, the gaps, the places where something could move without being seen. He had spent his entire life being the most dangerous thing in whatever room he occupied. The Romulans, he suspected, had never been in a room with something like him. They were about to learn what that felt like. Torith made her move at 2,100 hours. Not with weapons. Not with an ultimatum broadcast across open channels. With a transporter, a modified Romulan pattern that had been threaded through a gap in the Enterprise's shield harmonics with the surgical precision of a Tal Shiar operation that had clearly been planned before the warbird ever decloaked. The beam locked onto Riddick's biosignature in his assigned quarters on Deck 9 and pulled. It almost worked. The operative word being almost. What the Romulan transporter chief locked onto was Riddick's commage, attached to a water glass on the cabin's desk, placed there 40 minutes earlier with the casual precision of a man who had grown up in environments where being tracked was a precursor to being caught, and being caught was a precursor to outcomes he had no interest in experiencing. The transporter room aboard the Kazara received a comm badge and 6 centiliters of replicated water. Worf's tachyon pulse swept the Enterprise's interior at 2,103 hours and found 2 Romulan operatives in environmental suits already aboard, materialized by a second transporter beam, narrower and more precise, that had deposited them in a maintenance junction on Deck 9, while the first beam served as distraction. They were good. The suits were equipped with low-emission stealth technology that would have defeated standard internal sensors entirely. They did not defeat Worf. He was waiting at the junction with 4 security officers when the Romulans arrived, and the subsequent 3 minutes produced a security report that Picard read twice with the expression of a man reconciling professional satisfaction with diplomatic inconvenience. But the Romulans had accounted for Worf. What they had not accounted for was the variable that Worf himself had not accounted for. Riddick was already gone. Not captured, not fleeing. Gone, in the way a man goes when he has decided that the geometry of a situation has shifted and remaining in his assigned position serves no one's interests, least of all his own. He had been watching the warbird for 18 hours and had drawn the same conclusion Picard had drawn, roughly 6 hours faster, and had spent the intervening time doing what he did in every new environment, building himself an architecture of options. The maintenance corridors of a Galaxy-class starship were, by Riddick standards, luxurious. Wide enough to move through without compressing his shoulders, populated with enough conduit junctions and access panels to provide genuine concealment, and lit, in their emergency configuration, with exactly the dim amber wash that turned his silver eyes from a curiosity into a weapons system. He had 3 destinations in mind and moved toward the first with the unhurried purpose of a man who is lost to every sensor that isn't looking in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. La Forge found him 40 minutes later, which was not what anyone had planned. The chief engineer had been in Jeffrey's tube junction 36 Alpha running a diagnostic on the EPS relay that had caused the previous evening's cascade failure. The kind of detailed, hands-on work that La Forge preferred to delegate to his engineering staff approximately never. His visor swept the tube's interior with its characteristic electromagnetic thoroughness, processing spectrums no human eye could access. Which was why he saw Riddick before Riddick saw him. Or thought he did. You know, La Forge said carefully, to the section of conduit that appeared, to unaugmented eyes, to be empty. My visor picks up biosigns that standard sensors miss. Body heat variance, bioelectric field. You've been in this junction for about 20 minutes. A pause. Then Riddick unfolded from behind a conduit manifold with the resigned expression of a man who has encountered, for the first time in recent memory, a sensor he couldn't account for. Nice hardware, he said, nodding at the visor. Got it when I was 5. La Forge said. He stayed where he was, no comm badge tap, no alarm. Just 2 people in a tube talking. You want to tell me what you're doing in my Jeffrey's tubes? Riddick looked at him with the evaluating quality that had by now become recognizable, the rapid assessment running behind those silver eyes. LaForge, he determined, was not security. Was not threat posturing. Was genuinely curious, with the open-faced directness of someone whose relationship with technical problems had given him a particular comfort with complicated situations. "Romulans sent people aboard," Riddick said. "I heard. Worf's got them in the brig." LaForge paused. "Is that why you moved? Or did you move before that?" "Before." LaForge absorbed this. "You knew they were coming." "Figured." Riddick settled into a more comfortable position against the convict, apparently having decided that the engineer was not a threat worth maintaining maximum alertness against. "Your captain told me how they think. I ran the math. And ended up here. Needed to think. Hard to think when people are watching." A pause. "No offense. None taken." LaForge pulled out his engineering pad and resumed his diagnostic, because it was there and because sometimes the most effective way to have a real conversation was to pretend you were doing something else. "You know, your eyes, the modification. The way they reflect light. My visor works on a roughly similar principle. Different spectrum, different mechanism, but the core idea, seeing what other people can't, I get that." Riddick looked at him. Really looked, in the way he rarely did, not assessing threat or mapping exit routes, but actually registering the person. "You can see things nobody else can. Everything in the electromagnetic spectrum, pretty much. Radio waves, infrared, ultraviolet. It's—" LaForge paused, choosing honesty over the standard deflection. "Overwhelming sometimes. But mostly it means I notice things. Like men hiding in your tubes. Like men hiding in my tubes." LaForge smiled. Then, with the directness of an engineer who had learned that the most complex problems responded best to simple questions. "What do you actually want? Not from Starfleet, not from the Romulans. You, personally." The question sat in the junction between them. Riddick was quiet long enough that LaForge thought he wasn't going to answer. "To not be someone's asset," Riddick said finally. The word asset carried a specific texture. Old and sharp, the texture of something that had been used against him before. "Romulans want a weapon. Your captain wants a diplomatic situation he can manage. Your security chief wants to know if he can beat me." A pause. "Nobody's asked what I want. I'm asking." Another silence. LaForge ran his diagnostic and waited with the patience of someone who had spent a career coaxing answers out of systems that didn't want to give them. "Way out," Riddick said at last. "Back to my own space. My own rules." He looked at the conduit above him, the ship's skeleton, humming with power. Or somewhere close enough to that it doesn't matter. LaForge nodded slowly. Set down his pad. "The rupture that brought you here. I've been running analysis on the energy signature. The subspace shear points in the Devolin system are still active. The specific harmonic that caused the rupture could theoretically be recreated with the right configuration of the Enterprise's deflector array." He met Riddick's silver gaze steadily. "It's not a guarantee. Dimensional transit is not something we've successfully engineered. But it's not nothing either." Riddick processed this. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you asked what you want, and I'm an engineer. When someone tells me what they need, my first instinct is to figure out if there's a way to build it." LaForge picked up his pad again. "Also because Worf is going to find you in here in about 10 minutes regardless, and I'd rather you came out of these tubes voluntarily than have him come in after you." The silver eyes moved to the junction access point. Then back to LaForge. 10 minutes, Riddick said. "Give or take." Riddick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Romulans that came aboard. They'll have sent information back before Worf got them." LaForge looked up. "What kind of information?" "Everything their suits recorded from the moment they materialized. Deck layouts. Internal sensor positions. Crew biometrics." A pause. "My biometrics." The implication settled over LaForge like a cold EPS discharge. If the Khazara had Riddick's complete biological profile, his Furyan physiology, his neurological architecture, the specific frequency of his bioelectric field, then the next transporter attempt wouldn't need to search for him. It could target him with a precision that no amount of combadge swapping or Jeffrey's tube concealment would defeat. LaForge was already reaching for his comm badge. "Captain," he said, "I think we have a more significant problem than we realized." The information LaForge pulled from the captured Romulan operative suits took data 40 minutes to fully decrypt, which was 39 minutes longer than it usually took data to do anything, and suggested the Tal Shiar's encryption architecture had improved considerably since their last known intelligence exchange with Starfleet. What emerged from that decryption was not what anyone had been expecting to find. The biological data was there. Riddick's complete physiological profile, transmitted to the Khazara in the first 8 seconds of the operative's materialization before Worf had neutralized them. That problem was real and would require addressing. But it was the secondary data packet, buried beneath 3 layers of Romulan cipher protocol and flagged with a classification designation, that data identified as belonging to the Tal Shiar's Strategic Operations Division, that changed the shape of everything. Picard read the decrypted summary twice. Then he set it down on the briefing room table with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned that the speed at which he reacts to difficult information is itself a form of decision-making. "Summarize for the senior staff," he said to Data. Data folded his hands. "The Tal Shiar has been conducting covert operations in the Aranda sector for approximately 7 months. Their target is the Federation colony on Verity 4. A civilian settlement of approximately 12,000 inhabitants, primarily engaged in agricultural and terraforming operations. The colony is strategically positioned at the intersection of 3 shipping lanes that represent significant logistical value to both the Federation and the Romulan Empire." He paused. "The operation's objective is not military conquest. It is leverage." "Leverage for what?" Riker asked. "The Romulans intend to use the colony's population as a negotiating instrument to compel the Federation Council to cede navigational rights through the Calandra sector, rights that would effectively give the Empire a strategic corridor into the heart of Federation space." Data's golden eyes moved across the table. "The operation is scheduled to reach its activation phase in approximately 61 hours. At that point, the colony's primary power infrastructure will be disabled by a Tal Shiar infiltration team already in position, communications will be severed, and a Romulan fleet element currently staged in the Verity system's outer belt will move into orbital position." The briefing room absorbed this. Outside the windows, the Khazara held its position, patient, certain, operating on a timetable that had nothing to do with whatever happened in this room. "They knew we'd find this," Worf said. His voice had the flat quality it took on when anger was being compressed into something more useful. "The operatives were captured. The suits were recovered. The data was not fully destroyed." "Correct," Data said. "The encryption was sophisticated enough to require significant time to break, but not sophisticated enough to be genuinely unbreakable by Starfleet cryptographic systems. The data was intended to be found." Troy leaned forward. "They want us to know. They want us to act," Picard said quietly. He stood, moving to the window. The Khazara sat in his eyeline like a punctuation mark on a sentence he hadn't finished reading yet. "Commander Torith came for Riddick. She didn't get him. Now she's presenting us with a strategic problem that requires rapid response, a problem whose solution will necessarily pull the Enterprise away from this system." He turned back to the table. "If we move to Verity 4, she follows or she doesn't. Either way, she separates us from the Davolan system's subspace shear points, the only mechanism by which Mr. Riddick might return to his own dimension. Keeping him here," Riker said. "In Federation space. Accessible. It's elegant," Troy said with the tone of someone who finds a thing impressive and reprehensible in equal measure. "It's Romulan," Worf said. Picard clasped his hands behind his back. "The colony's situation is not manufactured." 12,000 civilians, 61 hours. Whatever the political calculus behind it, those are real people. He looked around the table. We respond. We have no other option that is consistent with what we are. His eyes settled. The question is how. Riddick had been brought to the briefing room at Picard's request. Not as a courtesy, though it was framed as one, but because Picard had spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous variable in any situation was the one operating on incomplete information. Riddick sat at the far end of the table with the watchful stillness he carried everywhere, silver eyes moving across the faces of the senior staff with the unhurried thoroughness of a man reading a room he has already decided he can handle. Picard presented the situation without editorializing. The colony, the timeline, the Romulan operation, the strategic trap within it. Riddick listened. Asked two questions: the layout of the colony's power infrastructure, and whether the Romulan infiltration team's position was known or estimated. Both questions were operational in nature, which told the senior staff something about how his mind was organizing the problem. You want to send someone in ahead of the fleet response, he said when Picard finished. Fast, quiet, small enough not to trigger the infiltration team's abort protocols. He looked at the colony schematics on the briefing room display. Disable their team before they can execute. Buy time for whatever cavalry you're planning to bring. The colony's communication array has been compromised. Data confirmed. A covert insertion team would need to restore primary communications and neutralize the Tal Shiar infiltration unit before the fleet element moves into orbital position. At that point, Romulan military doctrine requires confirmation from the ground team before the fleet engages. Without that confirmation, the fleet holds position. How many in the infiltration team? Riddick asked. Based on standard Tal Shiar operational doctrine for an action of this scale, between 8 and 12 operatives, Data said. What are the colony's lighting conditions? Data processed the question with the characteristic half-second pause that meant he was identifying its tactical implication. The colony operates on a 19-hour day cycle. The Tal Shiar's power disruption is scheduled for local midnight. Approximately 6 hours after our estimated arrival at Verity 4, assuming immediate departure. Riddick absorbed this. Looked at the schematics. Looked at Picard. You need someone who can move through a compromised facility in total darkness, locate and neutralize a professional covert team before they execute, and restore communications without triggering their abort. He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, without performance, as a recitation of observable facts. And you need them to do it without Starfleet authorization. Because if this is a Tal Shiar operation, any signal that looks like a Starfleet response pattern gets the fleet moving regardless of ground confirmation. That is an accurate summary of the problem, Picard said. The briefing room was quiet. Riddick looked at the colony schematics for a long moment. 12,000 people. The arithmetic of it was not something he was accustomed to factoring. His survival calculus had always been personal, immediate, individual. But there was something in the specificity of the number that worked on him. Not sentiment. Something harder than sentiment. The recognition that the same indifference to human weight that had governed most of his life was precisely the philosophy that produced Tal Shiar operations. He had spent a lifetime being someone else's asset. He knew what that looked like from the inside. I'm not doing this for the Federation, he said. I'm not asking you to, Picard replied. And I'm not doing it alone. His eyes moved to Worf, who had been watching him from across the table with the expression of a Klingon who has already answered the question internally and is waiting for the conversation to catch up. Him. Worf met his gaze. I would have suggested the same. Picard looked at both of them. The Furyan predator and the Klingon warrior. Two beings whose entire operational philosophy was antithetical to everything Starfleet's general orders were designed to govern, sitting across a briefing table agreeing on a course of action that was simultaneously the most tactically sound and most professionally irregular option available. He thought about the Prime Directive. About General Order 12. About the 17 regulations that technically applied to what he was considering. Then he thought about 12,000 people and 61 hours. "You'll have everything we can give you," Picard said. "Weapons, equipment, transport. Whatever you need." Riddick looked at the schematics one more time. "I need the lights off." The shuttle Cousteau dropped out of warp at the edge of the Verity system's heliopause at 1940 hours, running on minimal power signature. Shields collapsed to a passive envelope, communications dark, impulse drive throttled to the threshold where LaForge had calculated the Kazara's long-range sensors would read them as debris rather than a vessel with intent. It was the kind of flying that made Starfleet helmsmen deeply uncomfortable, and that Riddick, sitting in the co-pilot seat watching the approach geometry with the focused attention of a man reading terrain, had assessed as competent within the first 10 minutes. Worf was flying. This had not been a negotiated outcome. It had simply been the result of both of them arriving at the shuttle bay at the same moment, Worf moving directly to the pilot's seat, and Riddick making the calculation that a Klingon who flew a combat approach with the same unsentimental efficiency he brought to everything else was not a pilot worth arguing with. They had exchanged perhaps 40 words since departing the Enterprise. This suited both of them entirely. The Cousteau carried a tactical package that LaForge had assembled in 3 hours with the focused creativity of an engineer who had been told the parameters of the problem and left alone to solve it. 2 Starfleet tissue compression phaser rifles modified for silent discharge. A sensor dampening field generator that would mask biosigns within a 15-meter radius. Medical supplies. A portable communications restoration kit designed to interface with the colony's primary array without triggering the Tal Shiar's monitoring protocols. This last item being Data's contribution, built from scratch in 90 minutes with the cheerful thoroughness of an android who found improvised engineering genuinely enjoyable. Riddick had added 2 items from the equipment locker that Worf had not commented on. A pair of goggles modified by LaForge to serve as a light amplification backup in case the eyeshine proved insufficient in the colony's specific environmental conditions. And a length of high-tensile Starfleet tissue cable that he had handled with the familiarity of a man who had learned a long time ago that the most useful tool was usually the simplest one. "Tal Shiar team will have the facility segmented," Riddick said, breaking the silence as Verity 4 resolved from a blue-white point of light into something with geography. "Control the sections, control the population's movement. They won't all be together. Standard Tal Shiar dispersal doctrine," Worf confirmed. 3 to 4 operatives at the communications array, 2 at primary power, the remainder positioned to manage civilian containment. He paused. "They will be expecting a Starfleet response. They will not be expecting us. They won't know what they're not expecting until it's already happened." Worf looked at him sidelong. "You find that preferable?" "Always." The planet filled the forward viewport. Temperate, largely agricultural, the kind of world that looked from orbit like it had never had an urgent problem in its history. The colony settlement was visible on the night side, a modest cluster of lights against a dark landmass that, according to their timeline, had approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes before those lights went out permanently. They entered atmosphere on a trajectory that kept them below the Romulan fleet elements sensor horizon, using the planet's own magnetic field variance as cover the way a swimmer uses a current, not fighting the environment, moving with it. Worf brought them down in a dry riverbed 12 kilometers from the colony perimeter, a landing that was technically outside every approved Starfleet approach protocol and geometrically perfect. They moved out into Verity Ivy's night. The colony's outer agricultural zone gave them cover for the first 4 kilometers, rows of engineered grain crops standing 2 meters high, providing concealment that Riddick used with the unconscious fluency of a man for whom any environment immediately rearranged itself into a map of available cover. Worf moved beside him with the controlled discipline of a Starfleet security chief suppressing every trained instinct to establish communication with local authorities, request backup, and operate within a chain of command. At the colony's perimeter fence, standard civilian installation, not hardened, not monitored by the Tal Shiar's systems because it predated their infiltration and they hadn't judged it worth the operational signature to modify, Riddick stopped. His silver eyes swept the fence line. Then the building faces beyond it. Then the shadows between them with the thoroughness of something reading a landscape that most species would have perceived as simply dark. 2 at the fence junction north side, he said quietly. Romulan environmental suits, low emission. Standing still, they're waiting, not patrolling. Worf's hand moved to his phaser. His own senses were acute by human standards but operated on entirely different principles. He was reading air currents, microsounds, the subtle wrongness that years of tactical experience had taught him to feel before he could identify it. He trusted Riddick's eyes the way he trusted a sensor reading he had calibrated himself. Distance? 80 meters. They haven't seen us. They will not see us, Worf said, with the quiet certainty of a Klingon who has decided how the next 30 seconds will proceed. What followed was efficient and left no permanent damage, which represented a philosophical compromise that both men had arrived at independently, and neither had felt the need to discuss. The 2 Romulan operatives were neutralized with a precision that owed more to Riddick's ability to approach from an angle their night vision equipment couldn't cover and Worf's capacity to apply exactly the right amount of Klingon force to produce unconsciousness rather than something more final. They were inside the colony perimeter in 4 minutes. The settlement's architecture was functional and open. The design philosophy of people who had come to a new world with the intention of building something permanent, and hadn't yet needed to think about concealment. Wide paths between structures, open plazas, a central administrative complex that housed the communications array. Lights burning in residential windows where 12,000 people were moving through their evening routines with no knowledge of the Romulan fleet element holding position in their outer system, or the operatives moving through their streets like shadows with intent. Riddick read the settlement the way he read everything, as a system, with inputs and outputs, pressure points and vulnerabilities. The Tal Shiar had positioned themselves well. For at the communications tower, confirmed by the faint electromagnetic signature their suit systems produced that LaForge had briefed him to look for. 2 at the power substation on the settlement's eastern edge. The remaining 6 distributed through the civilian areas in a containment pattern designed to prevent organized resistance the moment the lights went out. 6 in the civilian zone, he said. We need them neutralized before we touch the communications array or the power station. The moment either of those systems registers interference, their abort protocol triggers. The abort protocol disperses them, Worf said. Harder targets in populated areas. Right. So we take the 6 first. Quiet. Riddick looked at the settlement's layout in his memory. The map data had provided cross-referenced against what his eyes were showing him now, the 2 images merging into something three-dimensional and navigable. Split. You take the eastern containment positions, 3 operatives, industrial district, better cover for your approach style. I'll take the western 3. Worf considered this for precisely the amount of time it took to determine that the tactical logic was sound and that his objection to operating without visual contact with Riddick was professional rather than tactical. Communication? None. Noise discipline. Riddick looked at him. Trust the plan. Worf held his gaze for a moment with the expression of a Klingon warrior reconciling operational necessity with the deep cultural conviction that trust was something earned across years of shared battle rather than hours of shared circumstance. Then he made the calculation that the hours they had shared had been sufficiently concentrated to compress that arithmetic. He moved east without another word. Riddick moved west. The western containment positions took 11 minutes. A duration that would have seemed impossibly fast to anyone who hadn't seen Riddick work in his preferred conditions and seemed, to Riddick himself, slightly longer than optimal given that the second operative had been positioned facing a reflective surface that had required him to adjust his approach angle twice. He rendezvoused with Worf at the base of the communications tower at the agreed position to find the Klingon already there, breathing slightly elevated, with a small cut above his left eye that suggested the eastern operatives had been more alert than their western counterparts. Worf looked at Riddick. looked at the cut on Riddick's forearm where a Romulan combat blade had made contact before its owner had been persuaded to relinquish it. Neither man mentioned either injury. 4 at the tower, Riddick said. 2 at power. We take the tower first, restore communications, get your captain's fleet moving. Then power station. The tower operatives will be expecting colony security, Worf said. Not us. Nobody's ever expecting us. Riddick checked the cable in his hands. Looked up the tower's exterior. 16 meters of standard colonial communications infrastructure with 4 Tal Shiar operatives at the top who were about to discover that their threat assessment for this operation had contained a significant gap. Worf watched him assess the tower with the particular quality of attention he had been paying to Riddick since the holodeck. The attention of a warrior identifying the specific nature of another warrior's competence. He had fought beside many people. He had respected many fighters. He had never before fought beside someone whose relationship with darkness was not a limitation being overcome but a language being spoken. You were made for this, Worf said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was an observation, precise, honest, carrying the Klingon weight of acknowledging a fundamental truth about another being's nature. Riddick looked at him. Something moved in those silver eyes that wasn't quite the cold assessment he wore everywhere else. Something that recognized the statement for the rare thing it was. Yeah, he said. Then, so were you. He started up the tower. The communications tower's upper platform was enclosed. A weather-sealed observation deck that the colony's engineers had designed for maintenance access, and that the Tal Shiar had repurposed as a command position with the practical efficiency of people who understood that high ground and line-of-sight communication were constants across every military doctrine in the known galaxy. For operatives. Environmental suits sealed. Romulan disruptors on active standby. A portable command console patched into the colony's communication infrastructure displaying countdowns, status indicators, and a direct uplink to Commander Torith aboard the Kazara. The platform's single-access hatch was locked from the inside with a Tal Shiar security protocol that would have taken data approximately 4 minutes to bypass remotely and that Riddick bypassed in 40 seconds using the cable, a maintenance bracket, and a working knowledge of the mechanical principles underlying every locking system he had ever encountered, which was a considerable number. Acquired across a lifetime of being on the wrong side of doors that people wanted to keep him behind. He came through the hatch from below with the cable wrapped around his forearm and the immediate, total commitment of a man who had learned that hesitation in a confined space was indistinguishable from surrender. The first operative turned toward the sound of the hatch and had enough time to register that the thing coming through it was not what their threat assessment had prepared them for before Riddick's momentum carried them both into the console housing. The second operative raised the disruptor and fired, the green energy discharge illuminating the platform in a burst that Riddick was no longer occupying by the time it arrived, having read the operative's shoulder rotation and stepped inside the firing line with the fluid geometry of someone for whom combat at close range was a spatial problem rather than an emotional one. The disruptor went somewhere that was not Riddick. The operative went somewhere that was not upright. The third and fourth operatives moved together, Tal Shiar training producing the coordinated response of people who had practiced for situations where individual action was insufficient. They were good. They were fast. They were operating in a sealed environment with controlled lighting that their suits were optimized for, against a target their intelligence profiles had described as a dangerous humanoid with enhanced visual acuity. Their intelligence profiles had not adequately conveyed what enhanced visual acuity in total darkness felt like from the inside of it. Riddick hit the platform's manual lighting override on his way past the console. A single motion, almost incidental, the way a pianist hits a note while thinking about the next phrase. The platform went dark. Not dim. Not reduced. Absolute dark, the kind that sealed environments produce when every photon source is removed simultaneously and the human nervous system, deprived of its primary sensory input, begins the millisecond process of fundamental disorientation. For the Tal Shiar operatives, their suit systems began compensating immediately. Night vision enhancement cycling up, thermal imaging activating. It took 1.3 seconds. Riddick needed 0.4. What happened in the remaining 0.9 seconds was efficient, precise, and left all 4 operatives breathing. A constraint that Riddick had accepted as an operational parameter rather than a moral preference, though somewhere in the arithmetic of 12,000 civilians and a Starfleet captain who had said your safety is not a transaction, the distinction had become marginally less clear than it usually was. He had the communications console active and was running Data's restoration protocol before the last operative hit the floor. Below, Worf heard the disruptor discharge from the tower platform and made the tactical decision to accelerate his timeline rather than wait for Riddick's signal. He was already moving toward the power substation at the colony's eastern edge at a pace that the 2 Tal Shiar operatives stationed there would not have identified as running because it was faster than most things ran. The substation operatives had better positioning than their counterparts. A hardened structure with limited access points and a clear sight line across the approach corridor that should have made surprise essentially impossible. Worf came from the direction that the sight line didn't cover, which required him to move through a gap between storage units that was narrower than his shoulders by several centimeters and that he navigated with the committed physicality of a Klingon warrior for whom the body's limitations were negotiating positions rather than fixed constraints. The first operative saw him at 6 meters and fired. Worf took the disruptor hit on his left shoulder. A partial strike, suit absorbing most of the discharge, enough getting through to produce pain that he categorized, filed, and declined to act on. He covered the remaining distance in the time it took the operative to recalibrate for a second shot, and introduced the operative to the conclusion of that recalibration process before it could be executed. The second operative chose to run rather than engage. This was tactically sound against most opponents. Against Worf, it was optimistic. The substation was secured in 4 minutes. Worf opened his communicator, the communications blackout lifting as Riddick's restoration work at the tower propagated through the colony's primary array. Worf to Enterprise. His voice carried the particular quality of a Klingon reporting from a position he has just taken, controlled, certain, with the undertone of something that has resolved itself satisfactorily. Colony communications restored. Tal Shiar ground team neutralized. You may proceed. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Picard heard Worf's voice come through the static of a re-establishing comm channel and permitted himself exactly 1 second of profound relief before returning to the business of the situation. All hands, battle stations. Helm, set course for Verity 4, maximum warp. Mr. Data, open a channel to the Romulan fleet element. All frequencies, standard diplomatic protocols. The Enterprise leapt to warp. Above Verity 4, the Romulan fleet element, 3 warbids holding position in the outer system with the patience of a plan about to execute, received 2 things simultaneously. The first was the restoration of the colony's communications signal, which their ground team's abort protocol required them to read as a compromised operation. The second was a Starfleet hailing frequency, broadcasting on all channels, carrying Jean-Luc Picard's voice with the particular quality of a man who has arrived at a situation with full knowledge and no interest in pretending otherwise. This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. Your ground operation has been neutralized. Your operatives are alive and unharmed, in keeping with Federation humanitarian standards. I am transmitting sensor records of the operations planning documents that I suspect Commander Tortha's superiors in the Tal Shiar will find considerably more interesting than she would prefer. A pause calibrated to allow that to settle. I suggest we talk. In the colony below, the lights were still on. Riddick stood at the communications tower's base and looked up at the stars. The unfamiliar star field of a universe that wasn't his, constellations arranged in patterns he had no names for, the distant glint of ships moving at velocities that his own universe had never achieved. Worf materialized beside him from the darkness of the substation corridor, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man managing a shoulder injury with professional dignity. They stood in silence for a moment. The colony sounds drifted around them, Ordinary sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of 12,000 people who didn't know how close the evening had come to becoming something irreversible. "Your captain," Riddick said. He meant what he said. About this not being a transaction. "Picard means what he says?" Worf confirmed. "It is occasionally inconvenient." Riddick absorbed this. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting, the way a lens adjusts when the focal point moves closer than expected. He had spent a life in a universe where meaning what you said was a tactical vulnerability, where people who operated on principle got used by people who operated on pragmatism, where the distance between a man's stated values and his actual behavior was always shorter than advertised. He was recalibrating something. Slowly, carefully, with the caution of a man who has been wrong about this particular calculation before. "The rupture," he said. "LaForge said it was possible." "LaForge does not say things are possible unless he believes they can be made actual," Worf said. Above them, the stars held their unfamiliar positions. Somewhere in the Devolan system, subspace shear points pulsed with residual energy that an engineer with a visor and a genuine interest in solving problems was already configuring a deflector array to address. Riddick looked at the stars for a long moment. Then he looked at the colony. The lights burning in windows, the ordinary persistence of 12,000 lives continuing uninterrupted. And something passed through those silver eyes that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite satisfaction but existed in the territory between them where a man who has spent his entire life operating in darkness occasionally glimpses the outline of something worth protecting. He didn't name it. He filed it. The way he filed everything, precisely, permanently, in the architecture of a mind that forgot nothing and reconsidered everything. "Let's go," he said. They walked back through the agricultural zone toward the Cousteau, the Furyan and the Klingon moving through the dark of an alien world's night with the unhurried confidence of two beings who had never needed the light to know exactly where they were going. The Enterprise dropped out of warp at the edge of the Devolan system 47 hours after leaving it, trailing the diplomatic aftermath of Verity for like a comet trails light, inevitable, visible from a distance, impossible to ignore. Commander Torith had accepted Picard's terms with the precise graciousness of a Romulan commander who understood that the alternative was having Tal Shiar operational documents transmitted to every Federation member world and several Klingon news services. The fleet element had withdrawn. The Kazara had decloaked one final time, held position for 11 seconds in what Picard recognized as a Romulan gesture of acknowledgement that occupied the ambiguous territory between respect and warning, and then folded back into invisibility, and was gone. The Romulan operatives had been returned via shuttlecraft, unharmed and unspeaking, with the complete sensor record of their operations planning documents held by Starfleet intelligence as insurance against the Empire's next impulse toward creative diplomacy in the Verity sector. Picard had logged it as a successful first contact situation with an extra-dimensional individual, and a resolved diplomatic incident. He had written the log entry with the careful specificity of a man who understood that what actually happened and what Starfleet Command needed to read about what happened were occasionally different documents, and that his 30 years of service had earned him the judgment to know which was which. Riddick had read the preliminary log entry when Data, with characteristic android literalism, had left it open on a briefing room pad. He had said nothing about it. But something in the quality of his silence suggested he understood exactly what Picard had done, and had filed it alongside the other data points that were slowly, carefully revising a lifetime of assumptions about what authority looked like when it was operated by people who meant it. LaForge was already at the deflector control station when they arrived back in the Devolan system, with the focused energy of an engineer who has been thinking about a problem for 2 days and is ready to find out if the thinking was right. His visor swept the subspace shear point coordinates as the Enterprise took up position, reading energy signatures that his instruments displayed as data and that he experienced, through the particular gift and burden of his augmented perception, as something closer to texture, the subspace fabric of the Devolan system pulsing with residual dimensional stress that was simultaneously a scar and a seam. "The shear points are still active," he reported to the bridge. The harmonic signature from the original rupture has decayed about 30%, but the underlying dimensional variance is intact. If I configure the deflector array to generate a matching harmonic pulse, essentially playing the same frequency back at the seam, the theoretical result is a controlled reopening of the dimensional transit corridor. He paused with the honesty of an engineer who respects the difference between theory and execution. Theoretical being the operative word, Captain. I want to be clear that we have never done this. The margin for error is significant. Understood, Mr. LaForge, Picard said. What do you need? About 4 hours to configure the array. And for everyone to stay off Deck 12 while I'm running the power transfer. Because if this goes wrong, it's going to go wrong in a direction that I'd rather not have people standing near. You have both. Riddick spent those 4 hours in a way that surprised everyone who was paying attention, which on the Enterprise meant essentially the entire senior staff operating at varying levels of professional discretion about their surveillance. He did not return to his quarters. He did not position himself in the maintenance infrastructure. He moved through the ship's accessible areas with the deliberate openness of a man making a conscious choice to occupy space differently than he usually did, to be seen, which for Riddick represented a form of trust that his entire history had taught him to treat as a structural vulnerability. He spent 40 minutes in engineering, watching LaForge work with the focused attention he usually reserved for threat assessment, asking questions that were technically precise and that LaForge answered with the generous thoroughness of an engineer who finds genuine curiosity genuinely refreshing. He spent 20 minutes in 10 forward, drinking something the replicator produced when he described, with minimal vocabulary, what he was in the mood for, and watching the stars through the lounge's curved windows with the expression of a man doing an accounting he hadn't expected to need to do. Worf found him there. Sat across from him without asking, which was its own form of statement. They were quiet together for a while. The comfortable silence of two people who had established, through the specific medium of shared darkness and physical honesty, a form of communication that didn't require words as its primary vehicle. In Klingon tradition, Worf said eventually, a warrior who fights beside you against a common enemy is given a name. Not their own name. A battle name, a recognition of what they demonstrated in the field. Riddick looked at him. You giving me a name? I am telling you that if I were, you would have earned one. Worf's expression held the particular quality of Klingon respect, hard-edged, undecorated, worth considerably more than its more effusive equivalents. What you did in that colony. In the dark. That was not the work of a man without honor. Riddick was quiet for a moment. Where I come from, honor's a luxury. Where you come from, Worf said. You survived without it. Here. He paused, choosing the word with the deliberateness of a Klingon who uses language as precision instrument rather than decoration. You chose it anyway. Something in Riddick's face moved through several expressions too quickly for most people to have caught. Worf caught them all and said nothing, because a Klingon warrior understood that some acknowledgments are private transactions that deserve the dignity of not being witnessed too closely. Picard met him at the observation lounge 1 hour before LaForge's procedure was scheduled to begin. The room held the quality it always held when something significant was about to happen, a charged stillness, the universe pausing between breaths. Outside the windows, the Devolin System's subspace shear points pulsed with invisible energy that LaForge's instruments were reading and that everyone else was simply trusting existed because the man with the visor said it did. I want to ask you something, Picard said, and I want you to understand that your answer doesn't change anything about what we're about to do. LaForge proceeds regardless. Riddick waited. If you could stay, Picard began. I couldn't, Riddick said. Not harshly. With the simple accuracy of a man who has looked at a question from every available angle and arrived at an honest answer. This isn't my universe. Your rules, the Prime Directive, the diplomatic protocols, the Federation's whole architecture of how things should work. He looked out at the stars. I respect what it's trying to be. I don't know how to live inside it. No, Picard said quietly. But you know how to protect it. Riddick looked at him. The silver eyes held Picard's with the particular quality of a man deciding how much of what he's thinking to say out loud. "You've got a good ship, Captain. Good people." A pause. "Worf's going to be fine." Picard smiled, small, genuine. "I'll tell him you said so." "Don't." LaForge's procedure began at 1,400 hours. The deflector array hummed with power transfers that the crew felt as a low vibration through the ship's decking, a subsonic frequency that set teeth slightly on edge and made the lights flicker in the pattern that everyone had learned, from the previous cascade failure, to regard with professional wariness. The shear point responded. Not immediately. Not cleanly. For 90 seconds the sensors showed nothing but the deflector pulse propagating through subspace and dissipating, and LaForge's hands moved across his console with the focused urgency of a man who has committed to a theory and is watching reality decide whether to agree. Then the seam opened. Not with the violent tearing of the original rupture, but with something that Data's instruments described as a controlled dimensional aperture, and that looked, on the view screen, like the universe folding back a corner of itself to reveal that something else existed on the other side. Riddick was in Transporter Room 3. Chief O'Brien, on loan from DS9, visiting the Enterprise for a routine equipment calibration that had been indefinitely extended by the preceding week's events, stood at the console with the expression of a man who has been asked to do something unprecedented and has decided that unprecedented is simply a category of engineering problem. "The aperture stable." LaForge's voice came over the comm. "For approximately 4 minutes. Maybe 5. Riddick stepped onto the transporter pad. The pad's surface hummed beneath him. The transporter room's lighting caught his eyes and threw them back silver. Mirrors facing a universe that had shown him, in the space of a week, more of what it was capable of being than he had encountered in years of his own. He looked at O'Brien. "You know where to send me?" "Close as I can get," O'Brien said honestly. "Can't promise exact coordinates. But the dimensional signature should put you in your own universe's vicinity of this system." He paused. "Whatever you find on the other side, good luck." Riddick looked at the transporter room door. Worf was there, standing in the corridor just beyond the threshold, arms at his sides, with the expression of a Klingon who has made his peace with an outcome and is present for it anyway. They looked at each other across the distance. No words. They had established, thoroughly and without ambiguity, that words were the secondary language between them. Riddick inclined his head. Worf returned it. "Energize," Riddick said. The transporter shimmer took him, that particular dissolution of matter into energy and back that the Federation had normalized into routine and that still, at its fundamental level, represented an act of extraordinary trust in the universe's willingness to reassemble what it had taken apart. He was gone. The aperture held for another 90 seconds, pulsing with the harmonic LaForge had tuned to it, and then folded closed with the quiet finality of something that has accomplished its purpose and has no further business being open. The Devolin system returned to its ordinary configuration, gravitational shear points cycling through their unremarkable patterns, stars holding their positions, the Enterprise sitting in the silence that follows significance. On the bridge, Picard stood at the view screen and looked at the space where the aperture had been. "Helm," he said quietly. "Set course for the neutral zone. Warp 6. Aye, Captain." The Enterprise turned toward the stars and went. Richard B. Riddick came through a tear in the universe and spent 6 days aboard the most sophisticated vessel his eyes had ever catalogued. A ship where people ate replicated food, solved problems with diplomacy, and genuinely believed that the galaxy was improvable. He did not become one of them. He was never going to become one of them. He was never going to become one of them. But he looked at what they were building, assessed it with the cold precision of a man who has spent his life identifying what survives and what doesn't, and determined that it was worth protecting. That determination cost him nothing he wasn't willing to spend. The Enterprise crew filed their reports, updated their databases, and returned to the business of exploring a universe that had just reminded them, not for the first time, not for the last, that its capacity for surprise was inexhaustible. Picard added a single personal log entry that would not appear in any official record. We encountered a man today for whom darkness was not a metaphor but a home. He taught us something about what courage looks like when it has been stripped of every comfortable abstraction. I find myself hoping his universe deserves him. Worf requested access to the holodeck combat simulation archives that evening and spent 2 hours alone, refining techniques against a program he had personally designed and that he quietly designated, in the file system, simply as R. Somewhere across the dimensional membrane, in a harder universe with darker stars and shorter distances between survival and its absence, a man with silver eyes looked up at a sky he recognized and felt, beneath the familiar weight of his own solitude, something new. Not peace. Not yet. But the shape of it. The outline. Something to navigate toward. That was enough. It was always enough to know the direction. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.